Okay. With us today, we have Rachel Krantz, and she is the author of the book Open. And I've I will have given your bio in advance of this. Don't worry. Um, and we are just thrilled to have her on the show. I'm totally fangirling here as a big bookworm and a bibliophile. I'm just thrilled to have our first author on the show. So, welcome, Rachel, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk with you.
So, your book, Open, reads kind of like a cautionary tale, unfortunately, about the ways that open relationships can go wrong. So, for the people in our audience who haven't had a chance to read it yet, can you give us a quick overview of what the book covers?
Sure, yeah. So the book is a reported memoir, the story of about 4 years in my life from 2015 to 2019 when I got into my first open relationship, which was also my first Dom sub relationship. Although, as you see in the book, part of the issue is we didn't exactly have any clear communication or boundaries around that. Um, and eventually, it was also my first emotionally abusive relationship. So it's kind of all those things at once. The story of how I began exploring non monogamy in all these fun ways at parties, threesomes, dating independently, swingers resorts, coming into my queerness, and really opening up in so many ways at the same time that it's the story of I'm getting increasingly bogged down in this primary relationship and kind of slowly losing trust in my own judgment or sanity because there was so much gaslighting. So it's kind of the story of how both those things can be true at the same time of, you can be in situations where on the one hand you're feeling increasingly liberated, on the other something is very wrong. And I just wanted to show a depiction of that in a non-monogamous context.
Right. And it was fascinating because when I first started reading it, I could tell where it was going. Like, this was not going to be a happy ending, right? This was not going to be a great story about non monogamy. And I was cautious because I thought, oh no, here we go. We're putting this out into the world that non monogamy is toxic and women are just being manipulated into doing this thing they don't want to do by men. And I was worried that this is going to be portrayed in the way everyone from the outside expects non-monogamy functions from the inside, right? um, but as you got further into the book, and the toxicity seemed to increase, uh, you still finished the relationship with a belief that non-monogamy was for you. And I was kind of surprised because most people would come away from this experience feeling like, well, I learned my lesson. I am not doing that shit again. So what was it that even in the midst of this, you found promising enough to continue it later?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons is, you do meet other people, like a group of swingers in the book who are all non monogamous, and they seemed very happy, and just getting to know them and really interviewing them and talking with them. Like, these were some of the healthiest long term relationships I'd seen. And in terms of friends I have who are non monogamous, like Aisha in the book, also just really admired the way non monogamy worked for them in their lives. So I had other examples of people it was working in a healthy and sustainable way for. And I was kind of learning the difference of, oh, okay, maybe it has less to do with which relationship model you choose and more about how do you communicate and is there a foundation of secure attachment. Um, and that there's going to be compromises either way, monogamy or non monogamy. But I think going on that journey and just seeing, wow, I'm into way more stuff than I thought I was, and just seeing kind of how much I enjoyed being given permission to explore. I didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I felt like I still have so much to discover. And also, coming in to owning my own bisexuality, I didn't want to have to choose in the
Right.
future, like and close off any of those experiences. So I felt it was also just kind of natural when I started dating someone again, which I kind of depict. I found I was craving to reconnect with someone else too, and to date multiple people at once. And it was just a different starting point of my being able to say, wait a second, it's not necessarily that in exchange for emotional commitment or some sense of stability that I have to, offer monogamy, that there are people who can provide both a sense of stability and security and allow you to have those freedoms.
Right, right. You touched on several things I want to ask you about. So, first of all, the Desire Crew. So, I was listening to your audiobook in the gym, and I'm in there lifting very heavy weights, sort of. And and then I hear you talking about people I know, and I'm like, oh my god, the Desire Crew is my crew. These are my people. I almost dropped the
Oh.
weights on my feet. So it was really exciting to hear you talk about Nate and Liv and Amy and Rory. You call her Amalia in the book, because these are people I know really well. I've spent weeks with them at Desire too. So as I was listening to you, talk about sitting on the big round bed at Desire, I'm like, I've sat on those bed with that bed with those people. So that was really fun because I had no idea in advance that they were going to appear in the book, and they actually played a significant role in the second half of the story. And I liked that you included them as examples of good swingers because the temptation is to portray swingers as these like down to fuck, just like hedonistic, greedy people. And I like that you found and connected with these people who I love so much and know that like this is really the representation of the world I'm familiar with that I want to be out in the world. So I was glad that they were included, and I was super excited to hear like they live amazing. They're coming. They're coming to my house next month.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So I was really glad that you included that, that representation of a healthy way to do this, that it's not all, just casual encounters or full on non-hierarchical polyamory, that there are these middle grounds where people can have long-term relationships and caring, loving, respecting connections, or respectful connections. So thank you for including them. The second thing was you talked about your bisexuality, and that's something that I've found the lifestyle has really helped both me and my husband with. So we got started with this because I had an encounter with my best friend in my previous marriage, and I was just like, what the hell is happening, and how can I get more of this? So when I started my relationship with my current husband, I said, this has got to be part of it. I've just discovered I'm bisexual and I don't want to give that up. And I'm not even sure how this will look going forward, but I want to have both. So the lifestyle was, a way for me to have everything. And for my husband, he didn't even really realize he was bisexual before. He would never have had the opportunity to understand that about himself or to explore it had we not gotten into non-monogamy. So for both of us, it's been a place where we can have everything.
That's great.
Yeah.
And that's great to hear that he feels he can explore his bisexuality, because one of the things I mentioned in the book is that I found in a lot of lifestyle spaces that it was very normalized that women would play with other women, but I didn't see men playing with other men. And I have heard that's changing. So it's really good to hear that those spaces were also a place of opening for him too, because I think it's just very unfair. And like I depict in the book, the more I was out about being non-monogamous, the more suddenly I realized I knew bisexual men, whereas before I didn't. They felt comfortable being out to me, because I was now also, I guess, identifying as bisexual myself, but also somehow deviant by being non monogamous.
Right.
And I think that a lot of the journey in the book is about my own internalized biphobia and also how I was part of the problem when it came to men of, in my early 20s. I think I would swipe left on bi men being like, oh no, that's not for me. And now, I'm realizing that the two men I've dated who are some of the most like viscerally sexy to me turned out to be bi men. And that, you know it just it you wouldn't ever guess, quote unquote. And
Right.
not that it would be a bad thing if you would guess, but just that I think I had equated being bisexual with femininity. And I like femininity, but I tend to really gravitate in men towards more of those masculine vibes. And I saw just how misguided that was. How sometimes those men were some of the most rugged.
Right.
So yeah.
Well, it takes a lot of confidence to overcome that
Hmm.
social conditioning, right? So,
Yes.
so and it's interesting that the more my husband has been open and honest about his bisexuality, the more people who we know we've known for years and would never have guessed they had any inclination in that direction have come to him quietly and said, "So, do you want to try some shit with me?"
That's
Because
great.
because they just need the opening, right? They need the
Mhm.
permission, and so yeah, so I was wondering, do you feel like non-monogamy was instrumental in bringing out your queerness, or do you feel like that was always there in a way that would have emerged regardless, but that the lifestyle maybe just allowed to flourish in an easier way? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the latter. I'd been feeling these feelings since I can remember. I just didn't know what to do with them and also would kind of diminish them in my own mind. I think because I didn't grow up, that was never the storyline of the woman ends up with another woman at the end was not a thing in the 90s. And um I think I'm very susceptible to fairy tales and stories. And because I feel such a strong attraction to men as well, it was easy to just kind of go with that and think that was supposed to be the story. That's the way it goes. And, the kind of narrative had seeped in of like, oh, well, all women are kind of fluid and, like it's hot for women to make out with other girls. And so I would just kind of say, like, oh, I probably have just internalized porn culture, or I'm just like getting off on the novelty and nothing else. But I would have crushes on women and people who turned out to later come out as trans and non-binary, and found that within the queer community itself, which I always had around me, that those friends and some of those people were also the ones, um, unknowingly perhaps gatekeeping or diminishing my feelings because they'd just seen me date cis men and were like, yeah, well, and so it wasn't taken seriously. Bisexuality, I think there was a lot less understanding around the fact that this is a real thing and that the diminishing of it, the erasure of it has real consequences. And in researching the book, I was shocked to find out that bisexual women have the highest rate of sexual assault, more than queer or straight women, a even higher rate than trans women for cis bisexual women, and the highest rate of mental illness, drug abuse. Queer women in general are twice as likely to have an eating disorder. So you see all of that mirrored in my story, right? I'm like struggling with all those things.
Yeah.
And it was pretty shocking to realize how, even as I'm detailing in the story, dating a woman and my first experiences with that, like I still had a lot of trouble until really the book came out and pretty recently owning the label bisexual, that I was still diminishing it because, oh, I just keep ending up in these more long-term relationships with men. But I truly feel that a lot of that is it's hard to untangle, but I do think some of it is that I continue to try, and it's just a lot harder to find women who want to date me than it is men. And I also tend to enjoy being a little more on the submissive side in primary or long-term relationships, or kind of being pursued, although I'm open to pursuing. But I think that sometimes that lends itself towards the more gender normative man pursues woman dynamic. And just when I'm on the apps, it's just, 90% men messaging me or more, and the women I message don't message back. So that's continued to be a struggle. Whereas those lifestyle spaces, it was so liberating because it was so easy.
Right.
Um, I didn't have to like get through the messages online or meet someone in real life like I did with Miranda. Um, but for me, I also think that's not quite enough always. Like I want to have relationships with people besides cis men, and I have faith that I will. It's just it's definitely it gives me sympathy for uh, men who date women. Of like, yeah, it's definitely a lot harder to like, yeah, have to play your cards right. Women are hard to impress, and I think when you're a woman yourself, you kind of that, so it can be
Right.
intimidating.
Yeah, I we wrote an article about a year and a half ago about our fuck it list, right? Like, what's the one thing we haven't done yet that we want to do? And I realized in writing that what I really wanted was to have a romantic relationship with a woman, and
Yeah.
it hit me hard when I first said that, when I first wrote it down. That was a really powerful desire that I hadn't really acknowledged because it didn't fit within the framework of our friends with benefits, swinger kind of dynamic. And I think I just kind of manifested this and blogged about it. And within a few months, I found a woman who is the most amazing, most beautiful, most like jaw dropping human I've ever met, besides my husband. Um, and yes, she came into my life. But the idea of going online and setting up a profile and trying to find a woman just sounded so onerous to me. I thought, I don't know if I can do that. Like,
Yeah.
I get access to a lot of pussy in the lifestyle, and I'll let that be enough for now, and then just see what happens organically. And it was kind of magical the way it happened. So
So did you meet her through the lifestyle or through just everyday life?
I did through the lifestyle. Yes, she and her husband
Okay, that's cool.
are swingers, and we met at an event, and the chemistry was just insane. So now I have a girlfriend. So that's
That's awesome. Oh,
yeah.
that gives me hope.
Yeah. Um, which I guess is a good segue into one of the parts of the book. A huge thread throughout the book is the idea of jealousy, and the fears and insecurities that come with this lifestyle, and and how sometimes there's this cognitive dissonance between who we want to be, our aspirational, confident selves, and then who we actually find ourselves being in these moments of insecurity and fear. And you described a particularly difficult night in the book when you were with a sexual partner who you called Mo, and you were kind of acting out because your partner Adam was out on a date, and you broke one of the cardinal rules of your relationship. You actually had sex with Mo in your bed. And as I was reading this, I felt like, well, that's a little bit hypocritical of you. Like, you're upset that Adam is out on a
Mhm.
date, but here you are also on a date and
Mhm.
feeling like you've been betrayed, but what's going on? But I also really understood that dissonance, right? Because you understand yourself well. You understand your feelings and your motivations, but it's hard, especially when you're insecurely attached, to believe your partner's motivations and to believe their attraction to you is strong enough to bring them back. Um, so this is something I've been struggling with a lot lately. For 10 years in the lifestyle, I felt like I'm not a jealous person. And then my husband started dating separately, and oh shit, I'm such a jealous person all of a sudden. So I wonder how you account for that kind of hypocritical cognitive dissonance that happens um,
Mm.
to us, to people in the lifestyle. I don't want to say it's just a female problem, but
Mhm.
um, yeah, how do you think about that? How do you process that?
Well, I think one way to think about it is that there's what you believe, and then there's like what is activated. So there's maybe what you logically believe, and then there's what your past trauma and fight or flight response believes. And I think a lot of the times with jealousy, people really get into a sort of fight or flight place because core attachment wounds, abandonment wounds, fear of being rejected, not enough, unlovable, it gets activated. It's a perfect situation for challenging your grip on your ego. And I think that's something you see me feeling compelled by throughout the book of like, wow, I can just sense how if I could overcome this, I'd be kind of so powerful because I just wouldn't, I'm basically placing myself over and over in this situation that is the most challenging thing for my ego. It's just triggering all my shit. Um, and and so I wanted to keep pushing it, but at the same time, I was very insecurely attached to Adam for several reasons. One, I think it was my first non monogamous relationship and I would have just struggled. But another was that it was this Dom sub dynamic and he was pushing the non monogamy. And this was very understood of like, if I want to be with him, I have to do this. And even though I had the ability to kind of hit pause where you see me doing that a few times, it was still understood that like that was a short time offer.
Mm.
And so I think I didn't really feel like I could say no or stop really. And that is a very difficult place to feel secure from. That on top of the fact that my jealousy was viewed by him as a irrational, immature emotion that needed to be trained out of me. So rather than holding it with compassion or trying to understand, what could I do that would make this better for you? It was usually like, why are you being so immature and irrational? And if you just looked at things logically, you'd see that nothing has changed, which was absurd. So a kind of diminishment of my feelings. That was the beginning of the gaslighting. Nothing has changed, even though he's, started dating independently and sleeping with other women and has another girlfriend, but he refuses to call her even a girlfriend to me, right? Um, so I think there was just a lot of like not feeling seen or acknowledged, and that fueled a further shame of like, not only am I feeling jealous, but I shouldn't be feeling jealous because if I were mature, if I were really loving, I would just want him to do whatever he wants. And so that shame fueled more insecurity, which then made him probably pull back more and want more freedom. It's very unattractive to
Right.
watch your partner be insecure and jealous.
Yeah.
And so we got locked in that kind of cycle. Whereas, you know, I'm always humble with jealousy. It could come back, but in my current experiences with my primary partner now, it's very, very different. It's
Mm.
just, I feel so much more secure, more kind of like Amalia, where it's kind of a turn on to me to think about him or hear about him with other women because I feel so secure in his devotion to me that, but I'm also a sub, that it's a way to create that sort of safe danger.
Right.
But all the while knowing like if it wasn't working for me, that he would prioritize me. But Adam and me see locked in a struggle throughout where he's like, you should know you're prioritized, you're basically primary, we live together. But he refused to like explicitly call it that, and viewed any hierarchy as immoral
Mm.
basically. So I think we were just locked in that power struggle that made the jealousy intense. So yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of the dissonance, I think I was just activated
Mm.
on multiple fronts and not really knowing how to deal with it, and not having a partner who is super supportive of that process. although, looking back, I'm sure it was a huge pain in the ass and that it was very unattractive. And I think he did try to be patient in his way a lot of the times, but we just, yeah, we weren't good in the end at really navigating that together.
Yeah. One of the hard things for me as I read the book was I recognized Adam in two of my relationships. So the gaslighting side of him was very, very evident in my previous marriage, where my husband was emotionally abusive and physically abusive with my son, and so jealous and
Mm.
possessive. So the gaslighting thing was so easy to recognize in him, and that was a monogamous relationship. But the harder thing to recognize was the narcissism, which I see a little bit of in my current husband, who is a lovely human, but who really believes in the infallibility of his logic and can get a little bit cold when we get into these disagreements. And so, we had a period of 6 weeks just recently where we were in this, headbutting situation where he was sure he was right, and he wanted to open our relationship more, and he was doing all the same things Adam was doing, just reassuring me that these are just your feelings, you just need time to process them, you need to do the work, and you should feel very secure in our relationship. And I was feeling cornered and threatened and emotionally triggered, and you want to be this confident woman who can send your husband out, but you're also feeling like everything in my life is being threatened right now, and you pushing me in this corner is making me feel like a frightened animal. So it was hard to see, because Adam is kind of the villain in your story, but to see elements of my husband who I love reflected in the villain made me feel a little uncomfortable at times. So I guess the question is, what do you think the line is between asking for what you want, um, and being coercive or emotionally bullying your partner? Because, there has to be a middle ground where you can ask, but you also need to respect their right to say no. So I don't know. What have you learned
Yeah.
about walking that tightrope?
Yeah, well, thanks for being so open about all that. I mean, first of all, I don't intend Adam to be the villain. I know he can be read that way, but I remind the reader several times that I think he wasn't getting up in the morning thinking, "How am I going to abuse my partner?" That's rarely how it works, and even most of the time, he was very loving, and that's why people stay in those dynamics. It's just that under stress, there's some very unhealthy behaviors that come out, and a kind of refusal to acknowledge one's own fallibility,
Mm.
but very willing to acknowledge it in other people, right? And that's kind of the red flag. And it's something that I think, you could see any gender express, but from what I've learned, men in relationship with women, men are going to usually, psychologists say, exhibit it more. And it makes sense because of how they've been socialized to view their own feelings as, well, not even feelings, right? To be
Right.
disconnected from the feelings, but rather they represent logic and rationality and just the truth with a capital T. Whereas women are taught to kind of question their own feelings all the time and maybe even push them down, in order to adhere to patriarchy or beauty standards or whatever else. And so you can have a dynamic where it feels kind of normal that the man would be asserting his rightness and the woman would be adapting to it.
Mm.
And one thing, Kathy Labriola, who's my counselor and who's in the book a lot, that she says towards the end is like, why should men use non-monogamy as another way to, like reinforce the very same structures and ideas that we're trying to reject, ideally through non-monogamy? So these ideas of, there being one right way, or domination over women, really, in some way, that they're the ultimate boss, that really this should be about are, yes, you have to negotiate. It's never just about your pleasure, but if you're feeling like anxious all the time or at a place where you're not really meaningfully able to consent, that should be a real concern for your partner. And yeah, it is. I think, you know, on multi-amory, they sometimes talk about the difference between rules and boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
The idea being if you're clear on your boundaries, like you can assert them, but it's up to you to enforce them rather than being like it's a rule which I impose on you. So, for example, rather than saying there's a rule that you're not allowed to fall in love with anyone else, that might not be a very healthy thing. However, it is your right and not unloving or unevolved to say it's a boundary for me that I don't want my primary partner to be in love with anyone else. And if that really is your boundary, then it's up to you in the end to enforce it or to offer the chance to the partner to say, look, this is your right to do this, but it's a boundary for me that I can't withstand that. And so I'm going to have to leave the relationship if you can't change that. And then it's up to them. So I've found that distinction helpful. And then lastly, in something you said of another thing that a psychologist, Dr. Ryan Witherspoon, said to me that was helpful in reviewing some of the gaslighting transcripts and just that pattern of Adam deeming my feelings not real because he felt they weren't true. So because he didn't feel they were true, like my fear that he would abandon me, that there's a discrediting that they even were real, which was maddening. And what Witherspoon said was, feelings are real, period. Whether or not the beliefs underneath them are true, they're happening. So if your partner is trying to diminish that, that's a real not okay thing. And he was also saying, or maybe this was the Buddhist monk, I'm forgetting which one, like that someone else should yeah, this was Tashi, the Buddhist monk who you meet at the end. Someone else should never be telling you what should and shouldn't be in your feelings. It is good to examine your own feelings, to not view your immediate reactions as the infallible truth with a capital T. Sometimes it is your shit to work through. But the real distinction that the monk made was like, that is very different from someone else telling you what you're feeling is wrong or you shouldn't be feeling that. That as soon as they start doing that, that is their shit. That's their delusion, basically, because they're basically saying that they're also fallible, completely subjective worldview is the truth, whereas yours is just a false thing and you should or shouldn't be feeling it. That's a big red flag. So I feel like, you know, these are things that I think exist in many relationships, and it's possible to have some of these patterns without it being abusive or something really bad. But I think a lot of people will probably read it and see, in me and some of my bad behavior in the book, some resonance of themselves, and also in him, perhaps some resonance of themselves or behaviors their partner is doing. And I just think like your intuition, if you're feeling uncomfortable, that is valid, period. It doesn't mean you necessarily have the right to enforce, things on your husband. But if he wants to be with you, you have the right to figure out your boundaries and to stick to them. And if he's saying, no, you shouldn't be feeling jealous in the first place or nothing has changed, that's only going to further the cycle of you feeling more jealous because it discounts, the validity of your feelings and also the fact that, of course, something's changed. If you're further opening up your relationship, something has changed. Or if you're feeling activated, that's a sign like something happened to trigger that. It didn't come out of thin air. So, yeah, I just think it's really important to be able to communicate about these things with compassion, to have a sense of your own boundaries, even though those can shift and morph over time, and to for those of us who like, dominant men and our women, like to not allow that to extend to having our feelings invalidated or being pushed into situations that are not about our liberation or our happiness, but rather kind of a different form of patriarchy in a
Right.
way.
Yeah. Yeah. Jessica Fern's book Polysecure was really helpful for us in helping to us to explain why we are experiencing these things differently, because my husband is securely attached and I am anxiously attached. And so I guess what the answer was for me ultimately, in terms of like what's the line between coercion and just asking, was like I had to decide, if I agree to this, what is my motivation for that? And ultimately, I feel like my motivation was, I really do want to get stronger. I do want to be more secure. I do want to be more trusting, more believing in, my worth. So even though I was kind of giving in, I was sort of acquiescing to what he wanted, and it felt uncomfortable. I felt ultimately at my core, it was something that I really wanted to do the work on.
Mhm.
So ultimately, I was doing it for me, and
Mhm.
I will be stronger, even though this is hard at the end. And that's what I want to be. So
Mm.
I kind of
I
felt like
totally get that.
that's the line, but there were some moments when I felt kind of pushed over the line in uncomfortable ways.
Hmm.
Um, Another thing you said in the book was, you talked about your casual encounters, and I'm going to quote you here. You said, after a decade of being treated like girlfriend material, I was now being treated by men as if I was little more than an amusing pit stop on the highway to arriving at respectable woman town, as if casual sex was all I wanted. Um, and I thought, again, you know, it was kind of painting open relationships in an almost stereotypically negative way. And I found myself wanting to jump in and defend non monogamy and be like, but I have wonderful friends and I've made all these great connections. And so I was kind of wanting to, to speak to the audience hearing this and say, it's not always like that. It's not always transactional and cheap. So I wonder, do you still feel this way about these open relationships, or was there something about your view of yourself at the time or your approach to non-monogamy during that period that attracted that kind of energy in that kind of relationship?
Yeah, the latter. I mean, what I'm referring to in that part of the book is the men I was dating who all identified as single and not non monogamous.
Mm.
So this was not people I would encounter in the lifestyle later who I have an immense amount of respect for. And I didn't feel those experiences, though casual, were not empty to me. I'm talking about your standard fuck boy, like your standard dude who's just dating and often non-monogamously, but doesn't call it that or
Right,
have a ethics around it and is just kind of like, all right, might have a couple people going on, but you don't know, or
right.
views an openly non monogamous woman as just a fun time, but not someone they would invest feelings in. So, yeah, that's not at all a reflection on my feelings about the non monogamous community, but rather I wanted to point out how, and I do point out how a lot of people who think they're not non monogamous and who identify as like single or just dating are practicing non-monogamy. It's just the difference is it's not consensual and above board.
Right.
And there's like a lot of don't ask, don't tell or overlap or whatever. And that for me, those men were the ones where it was the most harmful, usually, or the most I felt um like my feelings were discarded in a way that was new to me as someone who didn't hook up before much and who had just kind of had boyfriends. Um, I found it harder to attach and have someone I wanted to date attached to me. And I do think a lot of that is also that I was so insecure in my primary relationship, which was driving me to seek out my other relationships as something that might kind of help override my jealousy or anxiety, or that would
Mm.
make it worth it, make it even, make it worth it for me, or that would spark Adam's kink or his jealousy so that he would be kind of reignited in his passion for me. And that's not a good starting place, you know? It's no surprise that I felt used by people if I was on some level approaching it with a consumerist mentality myself of what can they give me, right?
Right.
Even if only subconsciously so.
So I heard you say on the Normalizing Non-Monogamy podcast, which is where I first heard about your book, that you are now 3 years into a relationship with someone new who you've been non-monogamous with, although the pandemic kind of interrupted that. So what are some of the key differences between how you and Adam approached your open relationship and how you are now organizing your relationships? What makes it work for you now? Um, in a way that it didn't work for you before.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so you meet Teo towards the end of the book, and that's still who I'm spending the majority of my time with, building a life with. Um, I think one difference is that I came into it the one who had experience with non monogamy, whereas for him it was new. He's also much less non monogamously inclined than Adam was. So I think it's just a much less challenging situation. You know, he's gone on dates, we've gone to a play party together. It's always very exciting to me. But so far he hasn't like had another girlfriend. So I think one reason it's a lot easier is just that he hasn't, you know, exercised his privileges towards that, whereas I have. So it's just a very different dynamic. But I think also, like I was talking about, I think part of the reason I'm so excited about the idea of him with other people is because I feel so securely attached, and so safe, and because we have very good communication around jealousy when it arises on his side, that I can really, it just helps to have someone who doesn't claim they're above jealousy, but rather can experience it themselves. And it's a much more of a position of like, okay, it's much easier for me to see what did I want to hear in those situations? What did I need? And to kind of offer that, but also say, but what would be best for you, because it's not going to be the same. So for example, um, you know, I think some of the things that I have wanted in the past or that I wanted with Adam are similar to what he likes, but also some of it is different. Like that he, when I come back from a date, would prefer some space at first rather than, you know, me being super amorous right away. And it doesn't mean he's mad at me. He just needs some time to kind of warm back up and adjust back.
Mhm.
So it's better for him to like cuddle and watch a movie or something. And so just getting really specific about like what is best for you, or if I'm going to have a date with someone or I want to plan a trip, when would you like to hear about that? Like
Mhm.
that was one thing I remember I was an issue for me, of that I often felt like triggered whenever Adam would bring something up because it felt like it could spring on me at any moment, that things could change. So I felt like, oh yeah, that would be helpful if I knew like if there's some sort of container he would like for those conversations, or a certain time of day even. So just really getting into the nitty-gritty of like what would help you the most, has been helpful for us, and to feel like it's a negotiation, a win-win rather than a lose-lose or something like
Right.
that. Yeah, but I do think obviously again it's a very different situation, and who knows? Like who knows how it's going to be when he does have another girlfriend. If he does, I'm sure it'll be more challenging, but I also have a lot of faith that it's going to be a lot better than it was with Adam, just because it's such a different scenario.
Right. Yeah, I wonder if because he is less non-monogamously inclined, if you feel maybe more ease about it because it's not being foisted on you, it's not being, pressured on you. He's not driving it as
Exactly.
hard as Adam was, so it feels more like it's a choice for everyone.
Mhm.
And yeah, you
Mhm.
talk about the rituals after a date and trying to figure out what is everyone comfortable with. And that's so important, but it's kind of a trial and error sort of thing, especially for for new territory. And I remember after my husband came home from his first separate date, I, as a person who feels in control by having all the information, said, "Tell me everything. Tell me every detail." Like I FaceTimed him immediately after she left. I said, "Tell me everything because you'll forget it tomorrow." And then I deeply regretted asking for that, because I found, no, that didn't make me feel more in control. That actually made me insane. So,
Yeah.
um, so yeah, trying to figure out, like, what do I need? I don't even know what I need, and maybe what I think I need is actually going to hurt me. That's where this can get so complicated, and I guess where you just need to give yourself some grace and your partner some grace, and so I'm glad you found that with your new person.
Thank you. Yeah.
And this might be, retracing some ground we've already covered, but if you were to give one caution, one thing to avoid for people who are newly entering the lifestyle of, however that looks for them, what would you tell them? What have you learned from your experience?
Oh man, so much. But I mean, one thing is I really would suggest that you not forego counseling or therapy. I think it really, really is important and helpful to have that support. Also, some form of community. So, whether it's a lifestyle community or even a Facebook group, somewhere where you have peers who get it, who also have some sense of kind of best practices, so that if you're not sure, you know, is this just my shit or is this really not okay? The way my partner is talking to me right now, that you have people to ask that question to, whether it be a counselor or friends or ideally both. So I think those are two very, very key things. And just again, like we were mentioning, that yeah, someone else shouldn't be telling you what should and shouldn't be in your feelings. And it's not unevolved if you feel jealousy. It's not something that should be looked down upon, but rather something to be treated with compassion and care. And if someone can't do that with you, then maybe you're not compatible. So I think, yeah, that sometimes in non-monogamous communities we can be a little bit like, oh, I never experienced jealousy, or I want to experience compersion, and like it's kind of shameful to be someone who's struggling with that. But I just think um it's not. It's This is a really difficult thing for most people. And we have to be able to talk about it. And the talking about it will make the shame lose its power. So I think the less we beat ourselves up for feeling jealous, the less it's able to perpetuate itself often.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Final question. Is there anything you wanted to include in the book that didn't make the final cut, or that you look back on now and wish you had or had not included?
Oh, what a good question. Let me think. Yeah, there was a lot that didn't make the cut. I cut like about a quarter of the book because it was so long when I wrote the first draft. There was a lot more Desire Crew, a couple other chapters going into Pam and Rich more. I mean, I wish I had included more of them and some more of my friends who are in these functional non-monogamous situations, just to really counterbalance. But it was interesting to see, like, it's a very plot driven story with me at the center, and to look at plot points and drama and what would keep people turning pages.
You need
Negativity
conflict.
bias
Yeah.
at play, like conflict, right? Plot equals conflict. And I think moving forward it'll be interesting to see how can character equal I mean, it's certainly very character driven too, but like, how can people who are in happy relationships be interesting? Because they are interesting. It's just that not as much is happening on the
Right.
surface, right? And so like that was interesting to see. Yeah, I don't know. I still have those scraps. They might be turned into something else or turned into short stories, fictionalized. I'm not sure yet. There was more Liam also. Um, and he, I think, is a really interesting part of the story. But yeah, he had to get cut down a bit. Um, so yeah, we'll see.
Well, I highly recommend your book. I love the way it's told. I like the fact that you just mentioned the plot and the characters, because it really does read like a novel, like the best memoirs do. And you did years of journaling and even audio recordings to make it as authentic as possible. So the dialogue is, really words that were exchanged between you. So it's fascinating to read, and I can't recommend it highly enough. So tell our listeners, where is the best place to get their hands on your book?
Thank you so much. Well, you can find the book wherever books are sold, on all online retailers, or ask your local bookstore to order it if they don't have it. Also, there's an audiobook that I narrated that's on Audible. And yeah, it's interesting. Apparently, so far, the audiobook is the top selling format, which is pretty unusual
Mm.
usually, and suggests that a lot of people are maybe listening to it but don't want their partner to know they're reading it, or don't want it on the bookshelf. But I do think it's really fun to listen to, because you can hear exactly how I intended, jokes
Mm.
to land, or beats, in my reading it. And yeah, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Rachel Krantz, my name. And I love hearing from people. I really appreciate it, especially my fellow non-monogamous people. The messages I've been getting have been so wonderful, of other people just really saying they appreciate the nuance, they appreciate the flawed depictions. And I was so worried about, yeah, making the community look bad, that it's really, I think, heartening to see that people get it, and that they feel like it's nuanced, and that you meet lots of different people along the way. And hearing from other people who, like me, had a really problematic first experience of non-monogamy, but also came away still wanting to be non-monogamous. So it's just cool to know there's more people like that out there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love hearing from people. And if you do enjoy the book, the last thing I would ask is if you can please, please, please leave some stars and a very short review on Goodreads or Amazon. It matters like way more than I thought.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Like
Yeah.
the algorithms run everything. So basically, this is going to be a book that spreads through word of mouth, and that's one way to help get it popping up in people's searches and stuff. So yeah, even if it's just a line saying, I liked this,
Yeah.
that really helps if you have a second to do that.
Yeah, it was wonderful. And I loved, because it was already so open and vulnerable, I loved hearing your voice speak your words. So I really recommend the audiobook. It's a very kind of intimate experience. I feel like we could be friends.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, me too. Hopefully, we'll get to go to Desire sometime at the same time. I'm like
With the Desire
hoping to
crew.
get back.
Yeah,
Yeah, with the Desire crew. I
that
know.
would be amazing. Thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us today.
Thank you.